It's not obvious to say. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here and to give a talk in front of this distinguished audience and in front of Gerd, who has been a friend, an inspiration, and a collaborator for so many years. So the talk is today about taming the complexity of manipulation and sensing and the role of haptic synergies. And we will basically see how simplifying things is necessary, but not always easy. And we will hopefully see how some of these can be done in robotics. I will discuss hands, basically, which is my long time interest and passion, and something that I share with DLR. I remember working with Gerd and his group on hands since the last, I think, 20 years or so. So the human hand is a wonderful mechanism, and it's very complex. If you look at the bones, at the arteries, at the vein system, at the ligaments, fascia, muscles that we have for the hand in the forearm, and the tendons that actuate our hands. The structure, the mechanical structure, and the nervous system that you have in your hand. It's absolutely stunning, the richness and complexity of the system. The skin itself is a wonderful construction of many redundant and interplaying sensors that interact in a very complex way that is still far from being completely understood. And I thought 20 years ago we were studying Merkel cells, Pacini cells, all the receptors, and you're surprised if you go now to the literature, you see that there are new interpretations and new roles for all this. So the workings of the hand are very complex and still to be understood to a large extent. It's a wonderful world where you want to work. So how can the brain cope with such complexity, with such enormous complexity, and do things almost carelessly, almost without thinking? So this is the starting wonder for us. And I think one of the ways to understand this is looking at the idea of constraints. The constraints that the body itself imposes on the learning and control strategies, what is going to be called synergies here. So these are the bounds that having the body imposes on the structure of the controller and the structure of the learning and the structure of the cognition that evolves out of the manipulation. And they have to be intended not as bounds. The fact that we have a structure, the fact that we have limits, these limits are important. They do not only limit the degrees of freedom, but make it possible for the brain to deal with the huge redundancy. And ultimately, the very ways in which we constrain all these degrees of freedom, all this redundancy, is how we organize our mind and how we have evolved our cognition system into the admirable form that we have on Earth. So these constraints organize and enable the body of the hand, and the idea of constraints that instead of limiting, enable, is important to the view that I want to express today. How does the embodiment constraints affect and determine the learning and control strategies of the hand? And we want to understand also how, if these synergies, if these groups of co-organized degrees of freedom are important, they form a language, and this language is the language that the embodied hand speaks. So if you want to have a dialogue with a human counterpart, then you have to understand this language. So I will, in this talk, I will go through three basic systems, but one is the motor synergies, the correlations in redundant hand mobility. One is the sensor synergies, the correlations in redundant receptors and cues, and then their integration in the sensorimotor synergies. So here is a picture that, oops, sorry. Yeah, I have no pointer, unfortunately. So, so here is the idea. So we have a large variety of sensors. We have a faster and massively abundant quantity of sensors, but we process them through a funnel-like idea, a funnel-like system of structure that creates cues and then goes to a higher level where you have a more abstract and parsimonious representation of information. On the other hand, based on this perception and on the cognition level, then you go down to acting on your hand. And there you have the motor synergies, which you might call early grasp if you call early touch the other side, where again you go back from very simple commands, very simple concepts, if you want, to the faster and more abundant actuation level. So let me start with touch and analyze what is the idea of synergies in touch. So touch is a very complex phenomenon. You have that the hand presses, you exchange forces at the resultant force level, and you change also the distribution of pressures and strains and stresses into a complex medium such as the fingertip. And again, this is very complex. How can we abstract this complexity? There are very simple ideas that have been around. One is extremely trivial and very well known to everybody. Dry friction is already, between surfaces, is already a very complex phenomenon. You have many normal forces, many tangential forces. And then there is this beautiful simplification of Coulomb's law that simply says, okay, forget about the distribution of things. Just take the normal resultant, take the tangential resultant, and you have this approximation. This is a very rough approximation, but it's very useful. Right? So in the past we did something a little bit building on this idea. We did a simple extension to the fact that if you know that on a fingertip you have a resultant force, a resultant torque, and you know the shape, you can also infer what the contact point is, just from the force and torque measurement. And if you know where the contact point is, you can also say how much friction is there and how much you can resist. So based on this, you can build sensors. This is a force torque sensor that only uses a force torque. I'm sorry, this is a tactile sensor that only uses a force torque sensors inside. And this is, I think, the first collaboration I remember with Gerd, who invited me a long time ago here for discussing and then using some of these ideas for building systems that can do simple things in this domain. So I don't know if you can see, these are all videos. They date back to 1989. But you can do things like on the top here, you have the recognition of the coefficient of friction out of the manipulation. You have on the right the sorting of objects. You can measure friction, you can sort objects, and you have a reactive grasp of an object here where the hand reacts to the forces that tend to pull the object out of the grasp. Or you can tactily explore objects and follow their unknown surfaces there. So kinesthetic touch, that's touch that is very simplified, was good back in '89. But of course this is not good enough. If you want to do touch, if you want to do hands, this is the first layer of approximation, but you have to do more probably. It is known that the tactile part of touch is important. And for instance, it is important in recognizing the softness of different objects. So if you touch different objects, and if you remove the tactile, the skin information, then you are at a loss. So here is an interesting video by Johansson in 2005 from Oria. And you can see the role of tactile sensing in manipulation. On the left, you have a normal subject. On the right, the same subject has been anesthetized and does not have feeling on the tactile receptors of the skin. It still has force and torque sensing, But as you can see, she is severely impaired in doing the normal operation of striking a match. So this means that it's not just force and torque. We have to go forward. We have to use the tactile cues. How can we use the tactile cues? Let me first mention this. This is Klasky and Lederman resume of a long time of work in this field. And they have observed how removing some of the degrees of freedom, some of the information from the hand very systematically reduces the response time and decreases the accuracy. Now, this reduces access to information is exactly what we mean by putting more constraints, using more and more abstract levels of synergies in this domain. So coming back, how can we use tactile cues that help us? It's a complex state of strain down beneath our skin. It's a complex system of receptors. The technology it's hard to measure the real distribution. Still now, in 2011, still now, tactile sensors are not any close to what we would like to have, unfortunately. It's even harder to actuate for haptic devices to actuate our finger pads so that we feel something that is not there, but it is remote or virtual. It's even harder. So what can we do? We need, my point is that we need some form of abstraction. One form of abstraction is the what we call tactile flow. If you look into the details of how the hand is how the skin is deformed, you can write equations for the energy density inside the hand, and of course I will not get into all the details, but there is a phenomenon that we have observed that you can bring to tactile, to the world of tactile, the ideas that have been studied in vision, and especially what concerns tactile optical flow. And indeed, if you make this parallel with vision, you can define tactile flow as the velocity by which the surfaces of stress within the fingertip expand while you move your hand and while you explore the environments. So you have this image of expanding while you press and seeing the image, internal image of pressure expand and move around the finger. So this is exactly what we define as a constraint. A constraint is then a projection of this motion along the surfaces. And the one consequence, for instance, is that the rate at which volumes within of the same deformation energy grow under increasing contact force increases in a way at a rate which is independent of the shape. So this means that to detect softness, you might not need to have a precise picture of the shape. What you need to see is how quickly the area grows. This is a prediction, and meaning that if you have a softer object and you press it, the contact area will spread faster. Right? It's very simple. This is analogous to what to do when you stop on your highway driving every day, when you see the image of the car in front of you growing bigger too fast. That means that you are getting so fast, too close, too fast. So basically we can abstract shapes to areas, as I was saying before. And that was demonstrated, this prediction was demonstrated by building a device that was showing this area to contact spread rate and providing results that are much better than just the force display that we had used at that time. The integration of the force and cutaneous display provided in the end result that on subjects showed that the integration of these two levels of synergies was almost as good as the real experiment. You can compare the bars on the right, sorry, almost as good as having the whole information. You can also predict that there can be illusions that come out of this synergy. because simply the equations are not completely defined. So you know that there is a null space, and you know that you expect that if you move, as you can see here on the left, if you move a pattern on a certain direction, the actual motion being the black arrow there, the perceived motion will not be the correct one, but will be tilted by the fact that you have this tactile flow or optical barber pole, tactile barber pole illusion. And that was also confirmed. And even more interestingly, in the interaction with the colleagues of ours that are working in the neuroscience department, it has been shown that this similarity between optical flow and tactile flow is really something that bears upon. I mean, it really, there are correlations even at the cerebral cortex level that show that same areas are involved in processing tactile and visual flow of the same kind, rotational or translational. So I thought this was interesting to say, and now let me go to the second part, to hands. How do we do synergies in the motor parts? In the motor parts, it's been a long time since neuroscientists have observed these correlations, these synergies and constraints in manipulation. But the quantitative work that motivated ours is more recent. So it has been observed in experiments with patients that people move their hands that have 25 roughly degrees of freedom, very often in a very much more simplified way. So if you take images or data from the hand that is moving, and you look at how the hand is moved, then you realize that only a few common modes are very, very often used. So the experiments that were done there were collecting data and then doing principal component analysis. And it turned out from these experiments from Marco Santello and others in neuroscience, in the Journal of Neuroscience, that the first 2 or 3 synergies only, the first 2 or 3 principal components that will be called synergies, explain 90% of the manipulation. That means basically that if you use your hand, normally for normal operation, 90% of the times you are only using 3 degrees of freedom, not the whole richness of the degrees that you have in the hand. So you are simplifying, you are using an abstraction. Here are the motion of the hands corresponding to the first 3 degrees of freedom. The idea now is how can I exploit this in robotics? I can use only these 3 motions. If I could move the hand in such a way as to use only 3 motions and combine them, can I do useful things? And indeed you can do. For instance, you can program a robot hand much more easily because you only have 3 parameters to tune or to move around, instead of programming all the 25 degrees of freedom in a completely uncoordinated way. And programming robots is one thing that everybody has agreed so far remains the toughest part of the job. You can also design hands with fewer degrees of freedom if you can connect the degrees of freedom of the hand in a nice way. Okay, so what does it mean in practice, in the geometry of synergies? It means that we are reducing the degrees of freedom. If we are willing to reduce to only use 3 synergies, for instance, we are moving the hand according to a model that constrains these degrees. So the first degrees will be closing something like this. And the second degree, as you've seen, is closing the hand like this. So if I only have 3, then I have only 3 degrees of freedom. What changes if you, what happens if you grab an object? Now, consider just the first synergy. The first synergy is moving this way. It's a rigid synergy. It's moving really rigidly constraining the joints together. And now you have an object that you want to grasp. When you arrive with the first limb in contact with the object, what will happen? Well, you can stop there, but then the grasp is not done. Or maybe you can stop one finger and continue with the second and until you get the contact, and then you go with the third until you get the contact. But then the hand is not in the shape that has been observed in the synergy space. Right? So what can you do? This is inconsistent. The finger would go inside the hand. And this is where recent work, also with DLR, has been focused. If you look back at the equations of the force distribution in hands, which of course I don't ask you to study now, you have to balance the external force, but you also have to comply with the friction constraints. And you typically choose, as we did in the very early video that I showed at the beginning, you choose the internal squeezing forces to avoid slippage. Right? But what of those internal forces can you control? Normally, you can control all that is in the null space of the grasp matrix, but for a hand that uses synergies, this is not possible because you do not have all the degrees of freedom. You are not controlling the hand, all joints independently. So, if you have, for instance, 5 contact points, 15 components of contact, 10 joints, in principle you could be able to choose the forces in the grasp, but if you only use one synergy, for instance, for simplification, then it's like moving everything together in a vise. And that means that the road to simplicity is not always so simple, and you have to consider things in a different way. So things do not stay together. The model that was in the literature is not holding. What is missing in the picture is compliance. And compliance and the control of compliance is one of the things, is one of the trademarks of research at the DLR, is one of the things that I think is most important and most will be really the next thing in robotics, is the control of compliance, understanding and controlling compliant structures. If you introduce a model of compliance, then you can imagine solving this problem. And compliance between what? Compliance will be between the image of the hand that you have in your mind, where you think the hand is, where you want to control the hand, and where the hand actually is. Right? And the difference between these two will be the compliance in the control system of the hand. So to understand how it works, how the model works, you can think of the inner representation of the hand going within the object, but the outer representation, the real hand, being compliantly connected to this set point and being repelled by the object, which will take the hand out of the object. And the repulsion forces will grab the object. So does this mean anything? Well, this is a nice, I think, visualization. So you have the virtual hand, that is the inner projection of the hand, that is controlled on this synergy manifold and moves according to this manifold. But the real hand will stop on the object and act forces on the object that are proportional to the displacements. And here is a slightly more complex grasp where the hand closes and you see the deformation of the virtual hand, the equilibrium hand with respect to the real hand. Okay, so there are a number of questions here. The question we wanted to ask was, so we know from those studies in neuroscience that the first few synergies explain much of the covariance of grasp approach. Is that also true for force distribution? I mean, the same synergies, the same correlations are important for force distribution. And also, this compliance, it is important, it is crucial, but we do not know it. How can we rely on these models if we do not know, we do not have a close estimate of the compliance? So here are a few results. So from this result here, for instance, you see that here is a grasping index, a quality grasping index, and on the axis is the number of synergies that you use. If you optimize the grasp and you use 1, 2, 3 synergies, the quality increases. But if you use more than 3, the quality is constant, doesn't increase anymore. Same happens here. You use the hand for grasping the more complex object, and the first, second, third synergies really improve the quality of the grasp, give you a better grasp. And if you go further, fourth, fifth, sixth, the quality is improving slightly, and then it's almost a plateau. That confirms, at least in simulation, that the first 2 or 3 synergies explain most of the grasping abilities of the hand. And indeed, it's a nice way to simplify grasping. So based on this, we have, of course, done more experimental research. We have built hands. This is the first prototype. This is a hand that, yeah, well, there is some video, but it's not, some rumors, but it's not important. So this is the hand that uses synergies to be programmed in a very, very simple way. You have here a clip from a broadcast from a news journal. So you can do things, as you can see, like pushing a syringe, moving a mouse, or using a simple tool. These things are simplified by synergies, but much more work has to be done. So discussion, a bit of discussion, human synergies can be applied to robotics. Not blindly, though. We believe that bringing the inspiration from human studies to robotics is not trivial, as trivial as copying, as mimicking directly. We do not believe in this direct path. We rather believe in a path that studies the example and abstracts to a layer where you have a mathematical and geometrical description that then can bear upon robot hands, and then hopefully back to human sciences and human studies. And I think this is a more general program of robotics. Now, as I was saying before, synergies have been used in a project that we have together with DLR and several collaborations. So you see, for instance, on the top, a motion of the DLR hand that moves according to synergies. Now, synergies there are implemented via software. This is work done by Thomas Wimbeck and his collaborators. Very nice piece of work. Also, you can see the programming through synergies done for precision grasp bottle, power grasp tube. What is important here is that only very few synergies are used, and programming is much faster, and the control of forces is better. In terms of hands with compliance, we have, you have seen yesterday the demos of the DLR hand, a beautiful example of a hand that is has 38 actuators, can change the compliance of every single joint. So I used to say that this is a hyper-realistic. It's even better than the human hand, which cannot do the same. And this is again Mark Grebelstein. And I would like now to recognize the collaboration, the pleasure I had in the years to work with the colleagues and friends here at DLR, Christian, Patrick, Florian, Sami, Alvin, and of course Gerd here. So I really think when you do a collaboration like this is the good synergies that we had with DLR. It's been a great source of inspiration. And when I think of the work that has been done on hands here, I really think that it's not just the hand that's done. It's not just Gerd's hand that has done things, but there is some other hand that really drove his hand in some sense towards the incredible results he brought to us. So I would like to thank you, Gerd, and thank you everybody for listening with attention. Thank you.
Thank you.